Before we begin tonight's story, take a moment to settle in. Let your shoulders drop. Let the day fall away. And if you enjoy peaceful journeys into the past, told slowly with care and quiet, please consider supporting this channel. A simple like or a subscription helps us keep creating stories to soothe your evenings. Now, close your eyes if you'd like. Breathe deeply and let us begin. Chapter 1. The morning begins waking in ancient Rome. Long before the sun had fully risen over the rooftops of Rome, when the marble temples still slumbered in shadow and the aqueducts whispered with the soft, endless sigh of flowing water, the city lay wrapped in the quiet hush of dawn. The bustling energy of the forum, the noisy bartering of merchants, the distant clang of armor from the Castra Praetoria, all of these daily sounds had not yet begun their chorus. In one of the countless insulae, the multi-storied apartment buildings of the poorer yet vibrant Subura district, a single room stirred into life. The room was modest, its walls plastered with faded red paint and decorated only by the simplest of objects. A chipped oil lamp, a bronze mirror dulled by time, a small wooden shelf stacked with folded linen, and a humble terracotta figurine of Venus. Here lived Livia, a woman whose name would never be recorded in the grand scrolls of senators or scribes, but whose existence was as real and rooted in Rome as the stones of the Via Appia. Her life, like that of many others, passed quietly between the cracks of empire and history, yet in her own small way, she carried rituals, thoughts, and emotions as deep and resonant as any emperor or orator. Livia's awakening was not marked by alarm or hurry, but by slow return, a gentle transition from the world of dreams to the waking world. She lay beneath a light woolen blanket, its texture coarse but familiar, breathing in the scents of her tiny chamber. There was a faint trace of oil and ash, the lingering perfume of burnt incense from the night before, and something earthy and damp that seemed to live within the ancient wood of the walls themselves. Above her, the ceiling beams groaned softly with the shifting of early risers in the floor above, and from far away came the rhythmic murmur of footsteps on cobblestone. She did not move at once. Instead, she allowed herself the quiet indulgence of stillness, of awareness, feeling the weight of her own body, the outline of her limbs, the cool touch of air against skin warmed by sleep. Her eyes traced the soft, growing illumination filtering through the narrow window, where slatted shutters turned daylight into golden stripes. For a few moments longer, she allowed her mind to drift. There was no schedule carved into stone for her day, no official duty to summon her. Only the silent, patient rhythm of survival, shaped by choice, chance, and necessity. Eventually, with the kind of practiced calm that comes from repetition, Livia rose. Her movements were unhurried, thoughtful. She swung her legs over the edge of the low cot and placed her feet on the cool tiles, inhaling deeply as she sat upright. There was a kind of ceremony in these moments, not formal or religious, but personal. She reached for the earthenware jug by the basin, its surface damp with condensation from the cool night air. Pouring water into the shallow dish, she watched the ripples shimmer in the dim light, then dipped her hands into the chill and brought them gently to her face. The coldness was both shock and balm, waking her skin, stirring her senses. She cleansed herself in silence, using a soft cloth to dab away the remnants of sleep, as if brushing away the shadows of dreams. In the tiny mirror, her reflection stared back. Not youthful, not old, a face of experience and memory. The line of her jaw, the arch of her brow, the faint scar above her lip, each detail a story etched into flesh. She did not rush to judgment or approval. This was the face she wore, the one the world would see again today, and it was enough. The room around Livia held onto the last breaths of night like a secret not yet ready to be told. Its walls, worn from years of smoke and time, enclosed her in a space both humble and sacred. A simple niche in one corner held small offerings, dried flowers, a feather, a polished stone, and a few copper coins. They weren't placed there for gods in the way temples demanded. They were more like quiet symbols of memory and meaning, reminders of people she had loved or lost, of moments that had changed her or saved her. Outside, the subtle life of the city began to rise like mist from the stone. A vendor's cart squeaked 2 streets away. Somewhere, a dog barked once and then fell silent. The faint clink of amphory being unloaded echoed faintly from a nearby taberna. Yet here, in this narrow apartment barely wider than an alley, time passed like a gentle stream. Livia walked slowly to the window, placing her hands against the rough shutters. When she opened them, the cool morning air touched her face like an old friend, bringing with it the scent of baking bread and damp stone. The sky was pale, somewhere between blue and silver, and the roofs of the neighboring buildings stood close, each one a collage of tiles, soot, and moss. She leaned on the windowsill and looked outward, not searching but observing. Rome in the early morning was not the same city that the senators paraded through or the generals dreamed of. It was quieter, older, more intimate. She saw an elderly woman sweeping the steps below, her motions as steady and patient as a heartbeat. A boy in a tunic too short for his growing limbs jogged down the alley carrying a bundle of firewood. Across the way, a curtain moved slightly and then stilled. Perhaps another woman like her, awake and watching, each behind their own thin veil of stone and story. There was no one rushing, no one shouting. Morning was a soft negotiation between darkness and duty, and everyone played their part. Livia stayed there for some time, her arms folded on the sill, her chin resting gently on her wrist. She did not feel the need to hurry. Her work was not like the baker's, bound to the first flames of ovens, nor like the water carriers, demanded by the rising thirst of the streets. Her hours belonged to a slower current, one that drifted between invitation and performance, attention and disappearance. It was a world where glances mattered more than words, and silence could be currency. Turning away from the window, she stepped barefoot across the room, the terracotta tiles cool beneath her feet. Her body moved with a kind of fluid memory, each motion deliberate, unforced. She paused near her modest shelf and fingered the items resting there. A slender vial of oil, a cloth pouch with traces of crushed lavender, a small clay dish that had once held honey and now held only dust. These were her tools, her comforts. She poured a few drops of the oil into her palms, rubbed them slowly together, and then pressed her hands to her shoulders, her neck, her arms, anointing herself not in religious devotion, but in care. She closed her eyes as she did this, not thinking of clients or coin, but of mornings long ago, when she was young, when the world felt wider, when choices had not yet narrowed into survival. There was power in this ritual, however quiet. In a world that saw her as transaction, as distraction, as temptation, she reclaimed, for a few precious minutes, the simple truth of her own being. She breathed deeply, her chest rising slowly, and for that moment, untouched and unseen, she was more than the role she played. She was just Livia, a woman with a room, a window, a little oil on her hands, and the morning sun beginning to light her walls. As the daylight gradually poured more fully into her chamber, soft and gold like warmed honey, Livia began to prepare the space around her with the same care she had given her own body. The room was small, barely enough for her bed, a stool, a shelf, and a basin, but it was hers, and within its walls she had cultivated a certain rhythm, a kind of sanctuary made not of wealth but of mindfulness. She folded her blanket with practiced ease, smoothing it with a hand that lingered at the edges, as though sealing away the night itself. Her gestures were unhurried, intentional. She swept the floor with a bundle of stiff reeds tied together with twine, moving the dust into a quiet pile near the doorway. The act was mundane, but there was something almost sacred in it, a recognition of the value in simple order. Many people passed through life in Rome in a constant state of chaos. Servants scurrying to fulfill demands, slaves marching in lines, merchants shouting for attention. But within these four walls, Livia preserved something gentle, something she alone could tend. She reached for a small cloth pouch and untied it carefully. Inside was a mix of dried rosemary, sage, and laurel leaves. She sprinkled a pinch of the blend over a tiny clay dish and lit it with a taper from her oil lamp. Smoke rose in a slow spiral, fragrant and faint, curling around the air like a whisper. The incense was not offered to a temple deity, though Venus stood in quiet witness on the shelf. It was more a ritual for her own senses, a reminder that her time belonged first to herself before the city demanded its share. She breathed it in slowly, eyes half-lidded, letting the scent conjure memories, some comforting, others heavy. It reminded her of home, of her mother's laughter, of the countryside far from the marble streets and stone forums, where fields once rolled like green waves under the sky. That world was gone to her now, perhaps forever, but the memory lived in that scent, in the echo of laurel smoke curling toward the ceiling. She sat then on her stool, back straight, hands resting in her lap. Her face held no expression, not yet. The expressions would come later. Smiles, glances, laughter, all worn like veils depending on who stood before her. But in this moment, there was only her true face. Calm, thoughtful, lined at the corners from years of watching and listening. She listened now, too, not to speech but to the life outside her walls. A child laughing, a mule braying, a distant bell. Rome was waking not all at once, but gradually in pieces. And she, like the city, was coming to life again. She remained there for several long moments, present and quiet, before finally rising once more. There was no need to rush. The city would wait, as it always did, humming beneath every doorstep and cobblestone. She glanced at the bundle of garments folded at the end of her bed, clean, worn, simple, yet chosen. Soon she would wash her face again, tend to her hair, dress herself not only in fabric but in intention. She would become, once more, what others needed to see, a figure of intrigue, of comfort, of company. But that transformation had not yet begun. In this early hour, Livia was only herself, without mask or meaning imposed by others. She picked up the figurine of Venus and turned it in her hand. The goddess's face was serene, lips slightly upturned, eyes cast downward in the timeless posture of beauty. Livia smiled faintly at the sculpture, not out of reverence, but in acknowledgement. There was a quiet understanding between them, as if the small terracotta form recognized something in her that words could not capture. She set it gently back on the shelf. The city's light now fell fully into her room, and the sounds of Rome had grown louder. The spell of solitude was ending, but it would return again, tomorrow and the day after that. For now it was time to begin. Chapter 2: Dressing and Preparing Rituals of Readiness. The act of preparing for the day was, for Livia, a ritual as deliberate and meaningful as any prayer whispered beneath temple arches. Though the city outside was stirring with louder voices now, vendors calling out their wares, donkeys braying under burdens, the faint clash of wood and bronze as shopkeepers opened stalls. Inside her modest room, time still moved slowly, like honey poured from a shallow bowl. Dressing was not a task completed in haste. It was a form of meditation, of becoming. She had long understood that her appearance was not only her introduction to the world, but her shield, her signature, and her offering. In a society where a woman of her profession was often judged by first glance, Livia had learned the art of subtle transformation. She was not a matron swathed in status-laden purple, nor a noble girl draped in silks and jewels, but neither was she the street-worn figure that some imagined when they heard the word meretrix. She existed in between. Her wardrobe reflected that liminal space, a carefully selected collection of robes and accessories chosen not for wealth or opulence, but for grace, distinction, and quiet control. She began with water. Returning to her basin, she poured more from the clay jug, the stream smooth and cold. This time, she did not just wash her face, but her neck, shoulders, arms, and hands. It was an awakening not only of the skin, but of her attention. Her fingers moved over her own body with the ease of familiarity, noting small changes, a fading bruise near her elbow, a scratch along her hip from some unseen accident in the night, the softness in her stomach that had grown with the passing years. She accepted each detail with the serenity of someone who had stopped resisting the shape of herself. She did not chase perfection. She pursued presence. Once dry, she unwrapped a bundle of clean cloth, revealing her garments for the day. The undertunic, soft linen, slightly yellowed with time, came first. She stepped into it with care, gathering the folds around her as if embracing something dear. Over it went the stola, dyed a muted ochre that complemented the tones of her skin. The fabric fell to her ankles, and as she moved, it flowed with her, neither too tight nor too loose. Around her waist she tied a belt of braided wool, looping it once, twice, then knotting it in a way that allowed the folds of the stola to fall in graceful drapes. She adjusted each pleat by hand, looking not into the mirror, but into memory, having done this so many mornings before. Her hair came next, long, thick, and dark. It held the scent of lavender from the oil she had rubbed into her palms the night before. She sat before her mirror, a small bronze disc slightly tarnished around the edges, and began combing with slow, practiced strokes. Her comb, carved from polished bone, glided through the strands with occasional resistance, each snag greeted with patience rather than irritation. She parted her hair down the center, twisting each side into a loose braid that she coiled at the back of her head, securing it with pins made of brass and horn. It was a simple style but elegant, one that required time but not extravagance. Once, years ago, a woman she admired had told her that beauty was not in decoration, but in attention. Livia had remembered that. She finished the arrangement with a few small drops of rose oil at her temples, not enough to announce her presence, but enough that someone standing close might notice and remember. Her final touch was the light application of cosmetics. A faint red tint made from crushed ochre along her cheeks, a soft darkening of her lashes using soot mixed with olive oil, and a dab of color on her lips from a beeswax-based balm dyed with wine sediment. Each gesture was unhurried, a layering of intention rather than artifice. When Livia finished with her hair and face, she sat for a while in stillness, allowing the soft warmth of the morning sun to rest upon her shoulders as it filtered through the window. The light at this hour was gentle and slanting, more suggestion than command, and it painted the room in tones of amber and gold. Her preparations were nearly complete, but the ritual was not only one of physical adornment. Before stepping into the streets of Rome, before walking once more among the murmurs and judgments of strangers, Livia took time to arrange herself inwardly. She opened a small wooden chest at the foot of her bed, lifting its lid slowly, as though disturbing a sleeping thing. Inside were objects not meant to impress the eye: old letters tied with faded cord, a broken brooch from her mother, a small pouch of silver coins carefully hidden beneath a false bottom, and a few scraps of poetry, words she had copied by hand from a borrowed scroll long ago. She took out none of these things. She only looked at them, reassured by their presence. These were the pieces of her that the world did not see, tokens of a self beyond profession, beyond survival. They grounded her, reminded her that behind the face she had just painted and the robes she had donned was a woman with thoughts, memories, and meaning. It was easy, in Rome, to lose one's identity to the roles demanded by others. The city was a master of spectacle and performance, from the thunder of gladiators in the Colosseum to the carefully orchestrated rhetoric of the Senate. Even in daily life, people wore masks, literal during festivals, metaphorical every other day. And so Livia had learned to wear hers, too. But she had also learned to take it off in moments like this, to remember who she was when no one was watching. That inner clarity gave her a power greater than any coin exchanged or compliment received. It gave her presence. When she finally did rise again, it was not with haste, but with quiet certainty. She gathered her modest satchel, a simple leather pouch containing a clean cloth, a small flask of watered wine, a tin of salve, and a few copper asses, and looped it over her shoulder. From a hook near the door, she took her light outer shawl, woven of thin wool, dyed the color of crushed figs. She wrapped it loosely around her shoulders, letting one end fall across her chest and the other hang free. Its softness was familiar, its weight like the final note in a chord, completing her. She turned once more to the mirror, not for vanity but for confirmation. The reflection that greeted her was composed, each strand in place, each fold arranged with care. Yet beneath it all, Livia could still see herself. That was important. She had seen others lose that thread, women who began as individuals but became only the expectations pressed upon them. It happened slowly, like a statue worn down by wind, the face smoothed away until only the posture remained. But not her, not today. She reached out and touched the edge of the mirror with 2 fingers, a silent gesture of acknowledgement, and then turned toward the door. The world beyond awaited not as threat, but as stage. And though she would walk its paths as a courtesan, that was not all she was. She was a reader of people, a keeper of secrets, a companion of both body and thought. She was, in her own quiet way, an artist of presence. And as her hand closed on the iron latch, and the door creaked open to the golden day, Livia stepped out not as a shadow of herself, but as someone who had chosen, again, to meet the world on her own terms. As Livia stepped out into the waking streets of Rome, her body moved with calm purpose, every fold of her garment gently stirred by the breeze that flowed between buildings like a whisper from the hills. Though she had completed her physical preparations, the deeper ritual of emotional readiness continued with each step. She descended the narrow staircase of the insula carefully, hand brushing the wall for balance, passing neighbors she barely knew by name but often exchanged glances with. An old man sweeping his doorstep gave her a nod, not out of friendliness, but routine. A young girl ran barefoot across the landing, her laughter echoing through the dusty corridors, untouched by the demands of the adult world. Livia observed without reacting, allowing these ordinary moments to settle over her like the soft dust of early morning, grounding her. As she reached the ground floor and stepped into the alley, the light of the sun fell fully across her shoulders, and the city's voice grew louder. But it was not yet intrusive. Rome at this hour was still soft at the edges, less like the roar of a lion and more like the purring of a great beast not yet disturbed. She made her way toward a nearby fountain, her sandals brushing the uneven stones with the familiar rhythm of habit. The fountain stood at the intersection of 3 narrow streets, its marble chipped and greened with moss, yet still elegant in its design. A statue of a nymph held an urn from which water poured in a constant stream, splashing into the basin below. Livia joined several other early risers there, housewives filling jugs, a young slave boy crouching to rinse his face, a man rubbing the sleep from his eyes. She waited her turn in silence, hands clasped loosely in front of her, face composed and unreadable. When she approached the water, She knelt slightly, cupping her hands and sipping just enough to refresh her mouth. Then, she used the rest to dampen the cloth in her satchel, dabbing her forehead and neck once more. She noticed her reflection briefly in the rippling pool, a fleeting, distorted version of herself, and for a moment, she wondered what others saw when they looked at her. Did they see the careful arrangement, the practiced expression, the curated grace? Or did they see through it all to the quiet woman beneath, full of private thoughts and stored away truths? Leaving the fountain behind, Livia walked along the shaded edge of the street, careful to avoid the sloshing waste that sometimes ran along the center. Rome's grandeur and filth walked hand in hand, and she had learned long ago how to step around both. The early market was beginning to wake nearby. The smell of fresh bread mingled with that of animal sweat and rosemary. Merchants were lifting cloth canopies and arranging their displays. Women with baskets on their hips bartered in low voices, while dogs sniffed and circled with twitching tails. Livia watched not as a shopper, but as a listener, a reader of tone and posture. This was still part of her preparation, the gathering of the city's energy, the measuring of its mood. Some days felt heavy with tension, others light with possibility. Today, the mood felt steady. She nodded slightly to a vendor she knew by sight but not by name, and he gave her a smile that spoke of recognition but not intrusion. It was a kind of mutual agreement between strangers, to see but not to question, to acknowledge but not to demand. Such small exchanges helped Livia build the invisible shield she carried through the city, a soft barrier made not of rejection, but of quiet boundaries. She was not unfriendly, but unavailable, and that too was part of her morning ritual, the delicate act of choosing what parts of herself to share and what parts to protect. Chapter 3: The World Outside Street Life and Temples. The streets of Rome stretched out like veins through a living, breathing body, narrow, winding, pulsing with movement even in the earliest hours. As Livia walked deeper into the city, the alleys gave way to wider paths paved with smooth stone, their surfaces worn to a gentle gloss by the passing of feet, hooves, and wheels. Though she walked with purpose, there was no rush in her pace. She moved like a ripple on still water, present, deliberate, aware. Her sandals made a soft pat against the road, and the hem of her stola gathered the faint dust of the earth as she passed beneath hanging laundry and the cool shadows of balconies. Rome, to most, was an empire. To Livia, it was a landscape of shifting thresholds, between public and private, sacred and profane, seen and unseen. Her life played out in the narrow spaces between these realms, and so she had come to know them intimately. Each street held its own flavor, its own rhythm. Some corners carried the salt-sweet scent of cured meat and olives, others the must of wine barrels or the smoke of burning resin. Here, life was not told in grand speeches or carved triumphs, but in the thousand quiet moments of survival. A shopkeeper lighting his brazier, a child chasing a runaway fig down a slope, two old women bent close in murmured gossip over a crate of bruised peaches. The temples were never far. Rome breathed through its gods as much as through its citizens, and even the most ordinary paths were shadowed by their presence. Livia passed one now, a small shrine tucked between two buildings, its alcove carved into weathered stone. Within it stood a figure of Mercury, god of travelers and commerce, his form smoothed by time, one hand lifted in blessing, the other holding the caduceus. Someone had placed a handful of grapes before him, half-eaten by birds. A ribbon, faded red, fluttered weakly from a nail above his head. Livia paused only for a breath. She did not kneel, nor pray, but she inclined her head slightly, a silent gesture of respect, less devotion than acknowledgement, like greeting a familiar neighbor. The gods of Rome were everywhere, woven into its daily life not as distant divinities, but as presences that touched bread and coin, laughter and grief alike. They lived in fountains, crossroads, doorposts, and they watched, always watched. As Livia walked on, she passed by others who made more visible gestures. An old man kneeling at the altar of Fortuna, whispering a plea with a coin pressed to his brow. A woman pressing olive oil into the stone lips of Juno's statue with trembling hands. These were private devotions made public, and no one stared or mocked. In Rome, faith was folded into every hour like breath into lungs, unspoken, essential, ordinary. Beyond the shrines and temples, the streets began to buzz with the cadence of morning. The city did not roar. It built itself slowly, like a song beginning in harmony. At a bakery, flour dust swirled in golden clouds as loaves were pulled from deep ovens and set to cool on wooden racks. Livia passed a cluster of boys gathered around a man balancing on a crate, reciting the exploits of Aeneas with theatrical fervor. His arms flailing, his voice rising and falling like waves. At another corner, a fruit seller shouted his prices while slipping a fig into the hands of a young girl who smiled with gratitude and scampered away. Rome was not only the capital of an empire, it was also this, a place where humanity spilled into the streets every morning in 100 unrecorded gestures. Livia moved through it all as part of the current, her presence quiet but noticed. A man glanced at her as he watered his horse, his gaze respectful, then distant. A woman, carrying a basket of lentils, gave her a nod of recognition. Not all knew her name, but many knew her form, her walk, her face. And though some might have guessed her profession, few spoke of it aloud. It was one of Rome's many open secrets, the kind that made the city breathe smoother, not rougher. She passed them all gently, without judgment or fear, as the sun rose higher, catching on marble lintels and red clay tiles, casting the city in a golden hush of warmth. Livia's path wound gently from the Subura district toward the northern edge of the Forum, where the hum of commerce and conversation thickened like morning fog. As she walked, her senses opened wider, not just to sights and sounds, but to the intricate weave of human movement that passed through the streets like a living tapestry. Rome was not merely stone and empire, it was people. The senator in his litter, the laundress with cracked hands, the child counting pebbles along the curb. They all played their parts in a city constantly unfolding. Livia didn't need to speak to feel connected. In Rome, words were often unnecessary. A glance could replace a sentence. A tilt of the head could speak more than any greeting. As she moved through the streets, she carried herself with the kind of poise that made people notice without always knowing why. She didn't look down in humility or up in defiance. She simply looked, fully, quietly, and with the weight of someone who had learned to read people the way a scribe reads scrolls. Not everything in her life had been chosen, but how she walked through it, that, at least, belonged to her. The temples became more frequent as she neared the Forum. Great columns of white and red rose into the light, their fluted shafts marked with the erosion of time and worship. At the steps of the temple of Castor and Pollux, a line of devotees waited, palms open with offerings. Coins, nuts, figs, whispered hopes. These twin gods, guardians of travelers and protectors of honor, watched the crowd from their lofty perch of carved marble, serene and impassive. Livia paused at a respectful distance, not because she feared the gods, but because she understood their role in the performance of daily life. To pass a temple without acknowledgement felt, to her, like crossing the threshold of someone's home without greeting the host. It wasn't about belief, it was about belonging. She sat briefly on a low stone wall beside the temple plaza, her shawl gathered neatly in her lap. Nearby, a boy played a reed flute, filling the air with a simple melody that looped like sunlight on water. A group of older women sat together under the shade of an awning, shelling beans and talking in low tones. And to one side, a painted performer in a tattered costume mimicked a patrician's strut, drawing polite laughter from a semicircle of workers on their morning break. Livia watched without interruption, soaking in the texture of the scene. The way laughter mixed with birdsong, the shimmer of sunlight on bronze armor worn by a passing soldier, the gentle clatter of dice thrown by two men gambling in the shade of an arch. These moments stitched the soul of the city together. Though her life might be overlooked by chroniclers and uncelebrated in marble, she knew she was a part of this living rhythm. Rome's temples were grand, its processions dramatic, but its true magic lived in these quiet, small continuities. The baker who folded his cloth the same way each day, the woman who brought the same coin to the same altar every Saturn's day, the boy who played the same tune each morning at the same corner. Rome did not stay alive through conquest alone. It lived because people like her, unrecorded, unremarkable to history, rose each day, dressed, walked, listened, waited, and hoped. She stayed on the wall for a long while, resting her palms against the warm stone, letting her thoughts drift. She did not rush toward business. There was time. She had learned to trust the city's rhythm. When it was right, the next step would come naturally, as it always did. For now, she simply watched the world pass by, wrapped not only in wool and linen, but in the quiet certainty of her own being. Eventually, Livia rose from her place by the temple, brushing a few stray threads of wool from her stola and pulling her shawl closer around her shoulders. The warmth of the morning had deepened, but the breeze still wandered softly between the columns and alleys, carrying with it the mingled scents of myrrh, fresh-baked bread, and wet stone. She continued on her way, moving through the wider arteries of the city where merchants and magistrates began to appear in greater number. The chatter grew more complex here, snatches of Greek and Latin woven together in casual debate, servants listing inventories, old men arguing over omens and dreams. She passed a group of scribes hunched over a marble bench, scribbling notes with wax styluses on folding tablets, their faces lined with fatigue despite the early hour. Nearby, two noblewomen emerged from a shaded portico, accompanied by a slave carrying a parasol, their silks rustling like water as they walked. One of them glanced at Livia for a fraction of a second, a brief, instinctive judgment, perhaps, before looking away without word or gesture. Livia neither reacted nor resented it. She had grown accustomed to such glances. They passed through her like wind through leaves. She knew who she was, and she no longer asked the city to answer that question for her. At the edge of the forum, she stopped again, not out of need but by intention. There stood the Temple of Vesta, its round form and perpetual flame marking the heart of sacred domesticity in the Roman world. The Vestal virgins moved within like phantoms in white, untouchable and revered, guardians of purity and continuity. Livia had always regarded them with a strange mixture of admiration and sorrow. Their lives were protected and honored, but also tightly bound. Years of ritual, silence, and submission to the fire. As a girl, Livia once imagined what it might be like to be one of them, to wear the veil and tend the eternal flame. But that world had never been meant for her. Her fate had been shaped by different hands, more private, more precarious, and no less sacred in its own way. She did not envy the Vestals now. They walked one kind of narrow road. She walked another. Both required strength, though of different sorts. She bowed her head for a moment as she passed, not to the temple, but to the women within, in silent acknowledgement of a sisterhood formed not through roles but through endurance. Past the temple, the road sloped gently downward toward a quieter district. She chose that path, not to escape the city's center, but to follow its rhythm inward. Here, the buildings were lower, the voices softer, and the smell of boiling lentils and rosemary filled the air from open kitchens. Children played games with pebbles in the shade of stoops. A pair of old men played latruncularly on a painted board, the clack of their pieces echoing down the alley. Livia moved slowly here, feeling the city exhale. She had always loved this part of the day, not the early hush of dawn, but the moment just after the rush began, when the world seemed to find its balance. It was in this hour that her mind was clearest, her heart most still. There was no performance yet, no client to greet, no decision to make. She could walk without being anything to anyone. She passed a wall etched with old graffiti, poems, names, crude sketches, and traced one of the lines with her finger. It read, simply, Vita brevis, amor longus. Life is short, love is long. She smiled faintly, though she wasn't sure whether the message comforted her or saddened her. Both, perhaps. Rome was full of such contradictions, just as she was. And so she continued walking, each step a quiet vow to remain part of the story, even if hers would be told only in whispers, in smoke, and in dreams. Chapter 4. The Subtle Business, Conversations, and Arrangements. By mid-morning, the sun stood higher in the Roman sky, gilding the city in hues of white and gold, and casting deep, cool shadows between porticos and columns. It was a time when many retreated indoors, to shaded atriums, to colonnaded gardens, to the relative hush of taverns tucked behind wooden doors. And yet it was also a moment when the true business of the city, especially the unseen kind, began to hum beneath the surface. For women like Livia, whose trade was not one advertised with signs or shouts but conducted with glances, tone, and memory, this hour was essential. It was not about offering, it was about listening. The work of a Roman courtesan was not what poets often imagined sensual, dramatic, filled with ripe fruit and silk. It was quiet, calculated, shaped by nuance and necessity. And it often began with conversations not behind closed doors, but in public spaces, where everything was hidden in plain sight. A bathhouse corner, a shaded garden path, the outer steps of a library. These were her offices, though no one would call them that aloud. Livia did not wander hoping to be noticed. She moved with intention, seeking familiar faces, lingering near those she recognized from past encounters. Not clients, always, but men who knew others, women who whispered between silk fans, scribes who remembered which names passed through which villas. She found herself that morning in one of her favorite haunts, a modest garden near the edge of the Celian hill, shaded by fig trees and bordered by a trickling channel of water diverted from a nearby aqueduct. It was not a wealthy garden, nor a formal one, but a place where people paused between errands or before appointments. There was a low stone bench there, half sunken in the soil and mossed with age, and Livia sat on it as though she had no purpose at all. But her eyes, soft, calm, dark, missed nothing. She noticed the senator's son who strolled past a second time without needing to. She marked the subtle shift in posture between two men who greeted one another with too much familiarity to be merely polite. She watched, she waited, she remained. In time, someone would stop to speak, not because she called out or invited them, but because she was there and because they knew what she was. Not just a woman for pleasure, but a keeper of secrets, a listener who never interrupted, a shadow who left no footprint behind. Conversation, for Livia, was a tool more precise than any blade. It built bridges and burned them depending on how it was handled. And so, when a man approached, well-dressed, mid-30s, his sandals too clean for someone claiming to walk far, she greeted him not with words but with a slight tilt of the head and a small, slow smile. He returned the gesture, sat beside her, not close enough to draw attention but not so far that he seemed uncertain. They did not speak immediately, Around them, others came and went, an old couple passing figs between them, a pair of young students quoting Cicero half-seriously, a woman feeding crusts to a pigeon. The garden held them all gently, and Livia waited until the man beside her exhaled in that particular way men do when they have finally decided to say something. His name was Marcus, or so he told her, though she doubted it was the name his wife used. He was not new to this. He spoke in circles at first about politics, the heat, the way the baker near the baths of Titus had raised his prices again. Livia nodded, made the right sounds, watched the corners of his mouth and the twitch of his fingers. This was the real negotiation, not of coin, not yet, but of safety, of expectation, of control. What did he need to be reassured of? That she would be discreet? That she would not ask questions? That she would see him not as a client but as a man? She gave him what he needed, slowly, without flattery, without deception. Only stillness, attention, and the comfort of being seen by someone who expected nothing more than truth in a moment. Marcus spoke of unimportant things at first, how the shadows fell across the Palatine now that spring was near, how the marble of the baths seemed to hold heat longer than it should, how his favorite horse had thrown a shoe. These were not details Livia needed to know, but she listened all the same. She knew better than to interrupt the slow unwinding of a man's sense of self. In a city where roles were heavy and expectations rigid, there were few places where a man could speak without performing. And so Livia offered him space. Her silence was not empty. It was crafted with care. She met his eyes only when necessary, nodded when his tone required it, and allowed the pauses to stretch long enough to feel like choices rather than hesitations. Eventually, the thread of his words changed. It always did, from mundane to personal, from surface to depth. He began to speak of his wife, not in bitterness, but with the soft guilt of a man who felt unseen. He mentioned her name only once and quickly, like an apology. Then he spoke of his work, the burden of it, the noise of it, the endless calculation that never seemed to quiet, even at night. Livia recognized this rhythm. She had heard it many times before, the pattern of a man whose identity had become too heavy to wear alone. But she did not offer comfort, not in the way others might. She offered no reassurances, no phrases drawn from plays or poems, no false wisdoms. Instead, she offered reflection. "It must be tiring," she said softly, not as a statement of sympathy but as an observation. He looked at her then, really looked, as if seeing her for the first time. That was the moment she waited for, not when he wanted her, but when he saw her. Not as a function, not as a role, but as another mind. She had learned that this was rarer than desire. Most men came to women like her seeking sensation, or silence, or escape. But the ones who returned, the ones who remembered her name weeks later, were those who had been given presence, who had felt, if only briefly, that they were allowed to stop pretending. Marcus reached into his tunic then, produced a small pouch of coins, and laid it beside her on the bench without looking at it. She didn't reach for it. That, too, was part of the ritual. Acknowledging the transaction too soon would reduce the moment to barter. Instead, she asked him where he would be that evening. He told her. The words came easily now, without hesitation. They spoke for a few minutes longer, not of arrangements or expectations, but of the wind that day and the particular shade of green on the distant trees. When he finally rose to leave, Marcus looked down at her with the faintest trace of gratitude on his face. It was not dramatic, nor romantic, nor even especially warm, but it was genuine, and that was enough. She watched him go, not because she needed to be sure of him, but because she believed that everyone, no matter how briefly they passed through her world, left something behind. When he was gone, she reached for the pouch slowly and tucked it into the folds of her shawl. The coins would be enough for a few days' food, perhaps even enough to buy another bottle of rose oil or a new comb if she haggled well. But more than that, the meeting had served its purpose. It had reminded her that even in the most transactional of exchanges, there could be a moment of something real. Not love, not even trust, but mutual recognition. In a city that often demanded masks, she had given him a place to set his down. And in return, she had been seen. That, to her, was its own kind of payment. She stood, stretched her shoulders, and walked back into the garden path, her steps soft but sure, as though she had never paused at all. The rest of the day unfolded not in grand moments, but in a series of subtle, almost invisible exchanges. Livia did not measure her work in hours or in distance traveled. She measured it in gestures. How many eyes met hers and then looked away more slowly? How many words were spoken in tones a shade softer than the street required? How many names were mentioned not in introductions but in passing, like secrets folded into cloth? After leaving the garden, she made her way toward a quieter part of the city, where the shadow of the Aventine Hill fell across narrow lanes lined with vine-covered walls and terracotta tiles warmed by the sun. It was a district not quite rich but not poor either, inhabited by merchants who had risen slightly above their class, minor magistrates, and retired soldiers with stories in their hands and silence in their eyes. Here, Livia could visit certain shops or taverns without suspicion, could pass through without drawing comment. She stopped briefly at a perfumery run by an older woman who greeted her with a knowing glance and a warm cup of watered wine. They did not speak of business, though business passed between them nonetheless. Names dropped into conversation like petals on water, questions phrased as compliments, warnings disguised as weather talk from there. She moved on to a laundry courtyard, where a friend of hers, a widow named Calpurnia, worked folding garments for noble houses. They sat together under the hanging linens, the smell of soaproot and ash thick in the air. Calpurnia shared bread, and Livia shared what she had overheard that morning near the Forum, whose son had fallen into debt, which senator's mistress had vanished suddenly, which villa would be empty this evening. None of it was gossip, not truly. It was currency. Knowledge was a map of Rome's inner rooms, and those who held pieces of it could navigate without stumbling. Calpurnia nodded, absorbed it, shared a bit in return. These small trades were not betrayals. They were survival. The city did not protect women like them, so they protected each other gently without declarations. When Livia left, she felt lighter, not because she had learned anything remarkable, but because she had once again affirmed her place within a quiet, invisible network of women who saw and remembered. Later in the day, she passed by a tavern in the Transtiberum quarter, not to drink, but to be seen. It was a place frequented by freedmen and scribes, men who worked in the bureaucratic arteries of the empire, people who knew things, noticed things, and occasionally needed company that listened rather than judged. She sat by the wall with a cup of spiced wine, allowing the room to flow around her. A few recognized her, nodded respectfully. One even approached, exchanged a few words, and left a token. Half a sestertius tucked beneath her cup, not payment, but perhaps a promise. She would remember his face. She always did. Her mind was a garden of small interactions, carefully tended, where no detail was lost. As evening approached, she began to make her way back toward her own district, her feet light despite the long walk. The sun had begun its descent behind the hills, casting Rome in tones of rose and smoke. There was no dramatic conclusion to her labor, no applause or official end. Her day had not one beginning and one finish, but a series of quiet openings and closings, like doors that led from one room into another. She had not sold herself today, not in the crude sense many might assume, but she had offered presence, absorbed burden, traced the outlines of need. And that, too, was part of the subtle business. As she returned home, Livia thought not of coins or clients, but of the sounds of the day, The way one man had sighed when he felt safe enough to be honest. The way a friend had laughed under clean sheets. The way the wind carried voices through stone corridors like prayers looking for a listener. She carried all of it with her, woven into the folds of her robe, stored in the curve of her memory. The arrangements she made were not contracts. They were dances, steps taken with care, with awareness, with rhythm. And when she finally climbed the stairs to her small apartment once again, unlocking the door and stepping into the scent of fig oil and old plaster, she felt not exhausted, but full. Not of triumph or desire, but of something quieter. Of meaning, perhaps, or perhaps just of another day lived with presence in a city that asked so much and so rarely gave anything back. Chapter 5. The midday rest, a pause in the day. By the time the sun had reached its highest point in the Roman sky, casting stark shadows beneath porticos and bathing the city in a golden haze of heat, the streets had quieted into a drowsy lull. The usual chorus of footsteps and shouts softened, replaced by the creak of shutters being drawn, the whisper of sandals on stone as citizens retreated indoors, and the low hum of fountains continuing their endless murmuring. Even Rome, ever awake and hungry, knew how to pause. For Livia, this was a sacred hour, a time not carved out for sleep alone but for reclamation, for returning to herself after the soft labor of attention and performance that defined her mornings. As she ascended the staircase of her insula once more, the air inside the building was cooler, still touched by the breath of morning trapped within the walls. Her feet moved more slowly now, not from exhaustion, but from the simple rhythm of the day folding inward. She passed the same neighbors in reverse, the same old man sweeping, the same children now quiet, hiding from the heat. She nodded at a familiar face, one that mirrored her own weariness, and offered a slight smile. They did not speak. It wasn't necessary. In a city where noise was often currency, silence between the known could be as valuable as gold. Her room greeted her like an old friend, unchanged and waiting. The filtered light through the window had shifted. Now it lay across the floor in wide golden bands, illuminating the patterns in the terracotta tiles she had walked across 100 times. She set her shawl aside, folded carefully, not tossed, and placed her satchel on the wooden stool beside her bed. The faint scent of rosemary from the morning's oil still lingered in the air, mixing now with the city's breath, dust, heat, and something almost sweet, like ripening fruit. Livia poured herself a cup of watered wine and sat on the edge of the cot, her eyes tracing the contours of the room not in scrutiny, but in calm recognition. She did not see what was lacking, only what was hers. The small dish of olives from the market earlier rested near the basin. A scroll sat unopened on the shelf, borrowed from a scribe who traded literature for silence. A comb lay by the mirror, its teeth catching the light. These things were not grand, but they were chosen, and in being chosen, they mattered. She slipped off her sandals and placed her bare feet on the warm floor, grounding herself in the quietude that noon had brought. This time of day did not demand anything from her. It was not filled with clients or conversation, with barter or pretense. There were no coins to count, no robes to arrange, no eyes to meet. It was simply hers, in a city that seldom gave anything without a price. She sipped her wine slowly, letting it linger on her tongue before swallowing. She thought about nothing in particular, just fragments of things. A man's uncertain smile, the way fig leaves moved in the breeze, a line of poetry that had wandered through her mind and not yet left. If she wished, she could sleep. Often she did. But today, she remained awake, content to drift in the in-between. This midday pause was not idleness, it was preservation. To hold herself steady for the hours yet to come. To refill the well from which she would later draw. In the stillness, she breathed fully, deeply. And for those moments, Livia was not a courtesan, nor a negotiator of men's loneliness. She was not a body to be watched or a name to be remembered. She was simply a woman in her room, alive, breathing, and whole in her own quiet way. Livia shifted slightly on her cot, leaning back on her elbows and tilting her head toward the open window, where the light had turned softer at its edges, as if even the sun had chosen to exhale. A single bird called from the rooftops. 3 clear notes, repeated, then silence. She listened, not as one listens for meaning, but the way one listens to water flowing or wind moving through grass. Without expectation, only presence. This was a time when the city seemed suspended, as if Rome itself had chosen to rest. Far below, carts stood still. Taverns had drawn their curtains, and even the stray dogs, usually trotting in search of scraps or shade, had curled into tight circles in doorways, their chests rising and falling in gentle rhythm. The sounds that remained were few and distant. A woman humming while grinding grain, a soft knock of wood against ceramic, the faint, irregular tinkle of wind chimes hung from a neighboring balcony. Livia closed her eyes. She did not sleep, but allowed herself to sink beneath the surface of wakefulness, drifting in that quiet, golden space where thoughts lose their edges and memory becomes mist. Her mind, unanchored from the demands of conversation and observation, began to wander through its own corridors. She thought of a path she had walked many years ago, narrow, lined with olive trees, somewhere beyond the city's reach. She remembered the feel of grass beneath her feet, the scent of earth and sun-warmed bark. She could not say when or why she had walked that path, or even if she had walked it at all. Perhaps it was memory, perhaps dream, but it lived in her, as so many moments did, fragments of a past that shaped her without name or record. She remembered, too, a voice, soft, serious, belonging to someone who once told her that the soul needed stillness the way the body needed food. She did not know if she believed in souls in the way the priests spoke of them, with incense and doctrine and fear, but she believed in silence. She believed in rest. And so, in these quiet midday hours, she fed something within herself that the morning had used and the evening would need. She did not write or read. She did not tidy or plan. She simply allowed the stillness to work upon her, the way the moon pulls gently on the sea, not changing its course, but moving something deep beneath the surface. After some time, she stood again, not because she felt compelled to move, but because her body asked to stretch. She walked slowly to the basin and refreshed her face with cool water, rubbing her fingers behind her neck where the heat had settled. Her reflection in the water was blurred and soft, like a painting left out in the rain. She did not try to fix it. Instead, she gazed at the moving shapes of herself, as if they were parts of a story she had not yet finished telling. She wrapped her arms around her waist, not from cold, but from a desire to be held. There were times when no one touched her all day, and there were times when she was touched by many, but not truly felt by any. This moment, this small embrace, was not about longing nor sadness, but about balance. It reminded her of who she was when she was not performing, when she was not smiling because she must or speaking because silence would be misunderstood. Here, in the quiet middle of the day, Livia reclaimed that part of herself which lived not for others, but simply for being. A woman, alone, complete, with the slow return of movement in the world outside her window, murmurs growing louder, distant footsteps reappearing, shutters creaking open again. Livia felt the stillness begin to loosen, not in discomfort, but with the natural rhythm of day rolling gently forward. She reached for a small roll of parchment on her shelf, not an official scroll or dramatic text, but a worn piece of writing she had copied herself, in her own uneven hand. It was a letter, long ago received and long ago faded from memory, but its words remained, even if the sender's name had slipped into shadow. Spoke of longing, but not romantic. It spoke of places never seen, of water and sand, of stars rising over hills far from Rome. Livia reread it as one might listen to music, not for plot, but for cadence, for the way the words unfolded softly like linen unrolling in a breeze. The letter didn't promise anything. That was what she liked most about it. Simply was. In a world where most things demanded or sold or judged, this letter offered only presence. She rolled it up again, tied it gently with a faded thread, and placed it back on the shelf. Then she sat down to eat. Her meal was plain. Olives, a wedge of cheese, a heel of bread still crusted with flour, and a small cup of watered wine. It was not meant for indulgence but for nourishment, and it served its purpose. She ate slowly, tearing the bread with her fingers, chewing thoughtfully, pausing often to sip and breathe. No one watched her eat, and so there was no performance, no decorum. Her mouth did not need to smile. Her hands did not need to rest neatly in her lap. She could lean forward, slump slightly, lick her finger without shame. It was, in its own small way, a return to the most basic truths of being human. The act of eating reminded her of her body, its hunger, its gratitude, its resilience. So much of her daily life involved separating herself from that body, offering it as image or vessel, depending on the hour or the company. But here, at her small table in her quiet room, her body belonged entirely to her. She did not have to make it pleasing or useful or worthy. Simply was, and that was enough. When the bread was gone and only olive pits remained in the small bowl, she sat back and let her eyes wander to the ceiling beams, where dust had begun to catch in the warm afternoon light. The final part of her midday pause was always the same and always different. Sometimes she would nap, letting her body relax into the softness of her cot, dreaming of gardens or voices she hadn't heard in years. Other times, she would stretch her limbs slowly, purposefully, like a cat, just to feel the edges of herself again. But today she reached for her comb. Sitting quietly before the mirror, she undid the braids she had so carefully woven that morning. The strands of her hair fell loose across her shoulders, darker now with the warmth of the day. She began to comb, not to prepare for anything, but simply to feel the motion of repetition. Pull and glide, pull and glide. It was a motion she had learned from her mother, though the memory of her mother's face had grown faint. Still, her hands remembered, and in that rhythm she found a kind of peace. The city would soon demand her again. Its faces, its voices, its requests spoken and unspoken. But for now, she had given herself this hour, this room, this food, this breath, this motion. And in doing so, she had reminded herself that she existed, not only as someone seen, but as someone who simply was. The stillness faded, yes, but it left behind something strong, something rooted. She stood and moved once again toward the door, not because she was needed, but because she was ready. Chapter 6. Afternoon Encounters, the Courtesan's Role. The hour after rest in Rome was a time of shifting light and renewed expectation. The heat of the midday sun still clung to the stone, radiating softly from walls and roads, but the tempo of the city began to lift again, stirred by necessity and desire. For Livia, this part of the day was often marked by the quiet transition from solitude to interaction. Not rushed, not jarring, but smooth and composed, like silk falling over a shoulder. She knew well that her presence at this hour was anticipated, though never announced. There was no schedule carved into stone, no fixed appointment written in wax, yet certain people in certain houses would expect her shadow to pass their threshold in the golden hush of afternoon. Sometimes it would be a request sent by a servant, delivered with a practiced neutrality. a folded message bearing only a time and place. Sometimes it would be a glance exchanged the day before, a word whispered near a fountain, a look held a moment too long in the market. Whatever form the invitation took, Livia answered not as one summoned, but as one choosing to step forward. Her work was not obligation, it was performance, but of her own design. She walked through familiar streets, each turn leading toward places known not only by name, but by feel. A marble stair warmed by sun, a bronze gate that creaked slightly when opened, the scent of laurel rising from a private courtyard. Her sandals tapped gently as she approached the house of one of her regular patrons, not a man of rank or wealth beyond modest measure, but one who valued presence, conversation, and the illusion of intimacy. His name was Gaius, though in her mind she never used it. For her, names belonged to formal speech, to records and scrolls and conversations held in the presence of others. In these hours, titles fell away. She became not Livia the woman, nor Livia the courtesan, but simply a vessel for emotion and attention, offered not without choice, but without burden. The door was opened by a slave who said nothing, only nodded and stepped aside. Inside, the air was cool, scented with wine and fig smoke. Light filtered through high, narrow windows, casting long lines across the mosaic floor. She stepped in with the quiet confidence of someone entering not a stranger's home, but a carefully memorized space. Gaius waited in the atrium, seated upon a cushioned couch with a cup of wine in hand and a book left open on the table beside him. He did not rise when she entered, nor did she expect him to. The performance had already begun, not out of pretense, but because they both understood their roles. He greeted her with a soft salve, and she returned it with a nod, allowing a small smile to touch her lips. No more was needed. They had done this before many times, and though each encounter varied, the shape of them remained familiar. She seated herself with deliberate grace, allowing the folds of her garment to settle around her like petals, and reached for a grape from the bowl before them. Gaius began to speak, not of politics or family, but of the wind, of the shape of clouds, of a bird he had seen earlier on the roof. His voice was even low, searching. She listened with care, not because the details mattered, but because listening was the most valuable thing she could offer. The city outside might demand his strength, his decisions, his money. But here, with her, he offered only presence. In turn, she gave him the same. Not love, not flattery, but attention, rare, priceless, undemanding. Their conversation meandered like a slow-moving stream, not toward a destination, but through shaded banks of thought and memory. Gaius spoke of dreams, half-remembered images that lingered after sleep, fragments of childhood, fears he could not name. He asked her, softly, what she thought they meant, but Livia did not pretend to be an oracle. She answered not with interpretations, but with questions of her own. "And how did you feel when you woke?" she asked, folding her hands gently in her lap, her voice a note above silence. This was the art of her work, not seduction, not manipulation, but the creation of space. Space for words, for reflection, for the things men could not say elsewhere. With her, Gaius did not need to defend or perform, and because of this he offered more. He spoke of his aging father and the weight of inheritance, of a friend who had recently drowned in a sudden flood near Ostia, of the strange guilt that settled over him when he felt nothing at the funeral. These were not things he could say to his wife or his colleagues or even to the gods, but to Livia, whose presence expected nothing except the present moment. He could bring such truths like offerings. As he spoke, Livia watched, not only his face, but his posture, the shifting of his hands, the way he looked toward the window when silence fell. Her attention was not invasive, but complete. She knew how to listen with her whole body, to receive the weight of another's words without trying to change or resolve them. And yet, her responses mattered. A glance downward, a soft inhale, the slightest parting of her lips. Each gesture was part of a delicate choreography that gave him permission to continue. She knew the rhythm of this man's soul, or at least the version of it he allowed her to witness. Sometimes he laughed, and she joined him, not too loudly, not too long. Sometimes he grew quiet, and she matched that silence without reaching to fill it. There was comfort in the balance they created, a kind of fragile architecture built not from stone but from trust. And when his hand brushed hers, she allowed it. Not because it was expected, but because it felt right in that moment, like punctuation at the end of a sentence that had needed to be spoken. They shared wine slowly, pouring it into shallow cups, watching the liquid swirl like time made visible. He offered her a fig, peeled and sweet, and she accepted it, her fingers briefly touching his. There was intimacy in these exchanges, but not urgency. They had all the time they needed, or at least it felt so. She reclined slightly, the curve of her body relaxed but alert, her presence soft yet unmistakable. She was not there to be consumed. She was there to be encountered. In this space, shaped by sunlight, cool air, and the quiet murmur of thoughts made verbal, the distinction between client and companion faded. What remained was simply connection, fragile, temporal, sincere. And though Gaius might later return to his ledgers, to his political duties, to his family name and the mask it required, here and now, he was only a man, and she was only a woman, and their truths met in the stillness between words. Livia understood that this, more than any performance of desire, was the essence of her role, to become the mirror in which someone might see themselves clearly, even if only for a little while. As the shadows lengthened across the atrium and the light began to shift from gold to amber, Livia felt the atmosphere begin to change. Not abruptly, not with tension, but with a natural transition, as though the afternoon itself were drawing a curtain on one act and preparing quietly for another. Gaius's words slowed, his posture relaxed further, and silence began to stretch longer between them. There was no need to speak now. They had arrived at that part of the encounter where silence became not an absence, but a presence in itself, warm, shared, restful. He leaned back against the cushions, his eyes drifting toward the painted ceiling, and Livia remained beside him, her gaze turned inward. She was not thinking of the next thing or the last thing, but simply allowing herself to exist in the space they had built together. These were the moments she treasured most, when her presence could offer peace without expectation, to give nothing and everything at once. That, too, was part of her work. She was not only a body or a listener or a performer. She was, in essence, a still point in a world that moved too quickly, too loudly, too carelessly. Gaius eventually reached for her hand, not in desire, but in thanks, and she allowed his fingers to rest lightly over hers. She knew he would not ask for more today. There were times when their meetings became physical, shaped by slow gestures and unspoken needs, but this was not one of them. And she did not feel rejected or relieved. She simply accepted it as it came. She had long ago stopped measuring her value by what men asked of her. The real currency of her life was attention, and in that, she had been well paid today. She rose when he did, allowing him to walk her back to the door. The house remained quiet, the air inside still cool. As they passed a polished bronze mirror near the entryway, she caught a glimpse of them both. His hair slightly disheveled, her face serene. They did not look like lovers, nor like strangers. They looked like two people who had remembered how to be human in each other's company. At the threshold, Gaius pressed a small, folded cloth into her hand. It held a simple token, silver, yes, but also a sprig of myrtle. The gesture said more than words. She placed it in her satchel without unfolding it and gave a soft nod in return. The walk home was quieter than usual. Rome was beginning to hum again as the sun began its slow descent. But Livia walked as if in a pocket of stillness that had not yet been touched by evening. She passed through streets where she had walked 100 times, but today they felt different, less like paths of necessity and more like quiet corridors between chapters. She passed a group of young men laughing in the street, their tunics rumpled from wine and sport. A woman sat at a windowsill above, combing her daughter's hair, the child fidgeting and humming softly. A pair of cats wrestled in a patch of sunlight near a broken amphora. All of it passed before Livia like a slow, quiet play, and she, still carrying the weight and warmth of her afternoon, did not hurry. There was no need. She had offered something real today, not passion or poetry, but presence. And though it would fade, as all things did, for a while it had mattered. That was enough. She reached her door as the first stars appeared above the rooftops and paused for a moment before entering, resting her fingers on the wood. Another meeting complete. Another story written, not in ink, but in memory. She opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it softly behind her, taking the evening in with her like a breath held close to the heart. Chapter 7. The shadowed evening watching the city dim. Evening in Rome came not all at once, but in careful layers, as though the city itself were reluctant to let go of the day. First, the sky began to change, from pale gold to soft rose, then into hues of deepening blue, bruised at the edges like ripened fruit. Then came the shadows, growing long and slow across the paving stones, climbing walls, pooling in alleys, stretching like cats over rooftops. Lamps were lit, first one by one, then in pairs, their flames flickering uncertainly before taking hold. You could hear the change, too, not just in volume, but in texture. The clang of daytime iron softened to the rustle of robes, the low clink of amphorae, the calling of names across courtyards. For Livia, evening was a time of return, not only to her room but to herself. She had passed through the city all day as shadow and shape, as listener and presence, as an instrument for other people's wants and words. Now she came home not as a character playing her part, but as a woman drawing breath in the stillness that followed. The door to her chamber welcomed her with a familiar creak. Inside, the air had cooled slightly. The day's warmth remained trapped in the walls and floor, but the window, opened just enough, allowed in a breeze carrying the scent of distant cooking fires, herbs crushed under sandals, the salt tang of the Tiber. Livia stepped inside and placed her things where they always went. Her shawl draped over the stool, her sandals beside the bed, her satchel set carefully on the shelf. She did not need to look. Her body knew these motions, performed them like a quiet liturgy. She took a moment to breathe deeply, letting the silence of her room wrap around her like a linen robe. There were no voices here, no expectations, just the slow heartbeat of evening. She went to the basin and poured water into the clay bowl, rinsing her face with both hands. The coolness startled her slightly, breaking the last of the day's weight from her skin. She dried her face with a cloth, then stood still, hands resting on the edge of the table, gazing at the small flame of her oil lamp, already dancing slightly in the darkening room. This was a time she rarely shared with others. Clients were not invited to her space. The work she did might be intimate in its shape, but it lived beyond her walls. Here, in this modest room above the murmuring street, she allowed herself to simply be. She sat by the window and watched the city change. Below, someone called out in song, half drunk but joyful. Across the way, a woman laughed, a sound that rose suddenly and vanished like perfume. Children chased shadows with sticks. Somewhere in the distance, bells marked the coming of night. She didn't need to see the capital to feel its presence, didn't need to hear the Senate to know that decisions were being made. The city moved with or without her, but this small vantage point gave her a kind of power the marble halls never could. Here she could see without being seen. She could feel the rhythm of Rome not as citizen or servant, but as witness. And as she watched the lamps glow brighter against the dusk, as the birds settled into their rooftops and the stars began to claim the sky one by one, Livia felt no sadness at the day's passing, only gratitude for its quiet ending and for the peace that followed. The city at dusk was not the same Rome that bustled under the sun. It became something softer, more secretive, a city of lowered voices and flickering light, of hidden courtyards and whispered conversations. Livia knew this Rome well. It was the Rome of thresholds and transitions, a place where identities blurred and new selves were quietly assembled behind lamplight. The baker became a singer, his voice echoing through open shutters. The scribe became a philosopher, muttering verses as he walked the same worn path along the river. Even the beggars gained a certain dignity in shadow, their outlines less desperate, their silence more profound. Livia sat still at her window, elbows resting lightly on the sill, her chin upon folded hands, watching it all unfold. From here, she could see not the grandeur of temples or the strict geometry of public forums, but the small, honest movements that made the city truly breathe. A woman shaking crumbs from a cloth, the slow turning of a pot over a fire, two neighbors trading herbs with nothing but a nod. There was a rhythm to it, a beauty in the ordinary. She lit her own lamp as the last of the natural light slipped below the horizon. It was a simple flame, fed with oil and trimmed wick, but it transformed the room into something sacred. The walls glowed faintly, revealing there were not as flaw, but as memory. The faint cracks in the plaster were rivers of time, leading back to moments lived quietly, some joyful, some heavy, all hers. She rose and moved through the space with the grace of someone who had lived long enough to know how to make peace with stillness. She adjusted the folds of the curtain so that it let in the night air but shielded her from outside eyes. Not because she feared being seen, but because the moment was hers alone. She took a small wooden box from the shelf and opened it. Inside were pieces of her that never left the room. A shell from a coastal trip years ago, a length of blue thread from a favorite tunic now gone, a single earring once given and later returned. These were not treasures in the market sense, no silver, no gems, but they held value that only memory could measure. She touched each one with a kind of ritual affection, like greetings between old friends. Then she sat again, not at the window this time, but on the floor beside her bed, legs tucked beneath her, palms open on her knees. This posture wasn't prayer, not in the formal sense, but it was reverent. It was her way of arriving fully in the moment. No words were needed. The silence itself spoke. Her breath moved slowly, and with each exhale, she let go of something the day had asked of her. A face she had worn, a word she had measured, a glance she had received but not returned. She let the quiet wash over her like cool water, rinsing away everything that was not essential. The world outside her door continued to shift, laughter rising, footsteps fading, voices echoing down corridors. But inside, she felt only presence, the kind that required no audience. No one called for her now, and she did not wait to be called. The city would dream its own dreams tonight, and she too would drift into hers. But for this brief moment, suspended between the work of the day and the mystery of sleep, she rested in a place beyond profession, beyond name. Just Livia, just breath, just stillness in a world that never stopped moving. In time, the shadows thickened into true night. The city, though still alive, began to lower its voice. The taverns would glow longer, of course, spilling their laughter and clatter into the alleys, and distant music would echo from courtyards where wine flowed freely. But elsewhere, the world quieted. Lamps were snuffed or shielded. Footsteps grew softer. Doors latched gently against the coming dark. From her window, Livia could see only the silhouettes now. People reduced to outlines moving like ghosts through torchlight. Even their voices seemed different. More careful, more aware of the silence they might disturb. She remained seated for a while longer, forehead leaning lightly against the wood of the shutter, her eyes following the slow dance of shadows on the far wall. Rome at night had always held a different kind of truth. It was no longer a city of power and show, of processions and proclamations. It became a city of breath, of whisper, of memory. Secrets walked freer here. So did dreams. And somewhere between them lived the quiet lives of women like her. Not always seen, not always named, but always listening. She pulled the curtain fully closed and moved slowly through the room. Each step measured not out of fatigue, but out of care. She gathered the small things that had been left out. Her comb, the water jug, a piece of linen folded at the foot of her bed. Her hands moved with deliberate calm. These tasks were simple, but they grounded her. They marked the boundary between the waking world and the night she would enter soon. She placed the figurine of Venus back onto the shelf where it usually stood, near the mirror and the oil dish, and touched its shoulder with her fingertips. An old gesture, half habit, half reverence. Not as prayer, but as recognition. The goddess, after all, was not just beauty, but endurance. A patroness of desire, yes, but also of longing, survival, and quiet power. In the softened lamplight, Venus seemed less a deity and more a companion, someone who watched over the forgotten corners of the world, where the unseen moments of life unfolded. Livia whispered nothing. There was no need. Some connections, especially those born in silence, spoke more clearly without words. Finally, she prepared her bed. She smoothed the sheet with the back of her hand, straightened the pillow, and placed the folded cloth over the edge. An old custom from her mother's home, a way of honoring rest. She loosened her hair and let it fall across her shoulders, brushing it only with her fingers tonight. Her robe she folded neatly and laid beside the stool, its fabric still holding the warmth of the day. Dressed now in a simple shift, bare feet on cool tiles, she sat once more at the edge of the bed and listened, not to the city now, but to her own breathing. In the same rhythm she had carried through every hour of the day, unnoticed until now. It was steady. It was hers. She lay down slowly, her body curling slightly on its side, and drew the blanket over her legs. Outside, a dog barked once in the distance, then silence again. She let her eyes close, not tightly, but softly, the way petals fold inward at dusk. The flame of her lamp flickered one last time, then settled into a steady glow. Night had arrived, and with it peace. Chapter 8: Philosophies and Stories, Minds at Work. There were hours in the night when even sleep seemed reluctant to arrive. Moments not of restlessness, but of quiet thought, of drifting reflection that flowed through the mind like a slow river. For Livia, these moments were never unwelcome. They came not as intrusions, but as invitations. Soft spaces between dreams and waking, where stories, memories, and questions floated freely without urgency. Lying in the darkness of her small room, eyes half-lidded, her body wrapped loosely in the folds of linen, she allowed her mind to open without direction. The day had ended, the streets had stilled, the obligations of her work had receded. But the mind did not simply stop, it wandered. And in this wandering, she found something close to peace. She thought of conversations she had overheard at the market, fragments of poetry murmured in a bathhouse, the rise and fall of a client's voice as he spoke of fate and fear. These were not noise. These were offerings. Pieces of Rome's soul left in her hands, unguarded, half-shaped, incomplete. The people around her, even those who did not know her name, carried whole philosophies in their gestures. A widow who lit a candle at the same corner shrine each evening, not out of fear but habit. A soldier who polished his armor not for war, but to feel something familiar. A senator who told her once, with trembling fingers, that he believed the gods were deaf, but still made his offerings, just in case. Livia remembered these things. She carried them with her like small stones in the folds of her tunic, tiny weights that reminded her of the hidden weight others bore. And she too, in her quiet way, had her own philosophies, not written on scrolls or recited to pupils, but lived. Her understanding of the world was stitched from the details others overlooked. The way people changed their voice when they spoke to someone they feared. The way eyes lingered slightly longer on kindness than on beauty. The way silence often revealed more than speech. She had no teacher but time, no temple but her own reflection, no disciples but the moments she noticed and chose to remember. This nighttime hour, when the moonlight filtered faintly through the slatted shutter and painted silver ribbons across the floor, was when those thoughts gathered like gentle wind. She did not reach for them. She let them come. Sometimes they brought comfort. Other times they brought questions. Had she made the right choices? Was her life a path walked freely, or one chosen by necessity? She did not dwell in sorrow. Regret, she knew, was a kind of poison that wore a soft voice. But reflection was different. It was a mirror, not a wound. She did not seek to change what had passed. She sought only to understand it, to see it clearly with all its shadow and shape. And in that seeing, she often found something like truth, not absolute but real enough for her. The kind of truth that came not from the lips of priests or philosophers, but from the eyes of a dying man, or the trembling laugh of someone who had not been touched kindly in years. That was the world she understood. That was the Rome she lived in, not marble, not empire, but human. This nighttime hour, when the moonlight filtered faintly through the slatted shutter and painted silver ribbons across the floor, was when those thoughts gathered like gentle wind. She did not reach for them. She let them come. Sometimes they brought comfort. Other times they brought questions. Had she made the right choices? Was her life a path walked freely, or one chosen by necessity? She did not dwell in sorrow. Regret, she knew, was a kind of poison that wore a soft voice. But reflection was different. It was a mirror, not a wound. She did not seek to change what had passed. She sought only to understand it, to see it clearly with all its shadow and shape. And in that seeing, she often found something like truth, not absolute, but real enough for her. The kind of truth that came not from the lips of priests or philosophers, but from the eyes of a dying man, or the trembling laugh of someone who had not been touched kindly in years. That was the world she understood. That was the Rome she lived in, not marble, not empire, but human. She remembered a man from long ago, older, with a stoop in his spine and eyes that always seemed to look slightly beyond her, as though seeing not just her face but a memory she resembled. He had been kind in the quietest way, never touching her with more than a word, never asking for more than presence. He had spoken to her of the Stoics, not as a teacher, but as someone still trying to believe. He told her that virtue was its own reward, that control over the self was the path to peace. She had listened, curious but unconvinced. She did not mock him. There was no cruelty in her skepticism, but she wondered if such philosophies had ever been tested against hunger, against grief, against the coldness of being alone in a room with no lamp. He had answered her once, when she asked why so many men who spoke of peace also sought power. Because they fear they will be forgotten, he had said. Even those who pretend not to care. that stayed with her, not because it was wise, but because it was honest. And then there was another, years later, who believed in nothing at all. No gods, no virtue, no fate, only appetite and consequence. He had spoken freely, his laughter harsh and hollow, always filling the room, always leaving silence behind when it was gone. Yet even he, for all his declarations of indifference, had once wept in her arms without understanding why. "What does it matter?" he had asked. "The city will eat us all." She hadn't answered. She only held him, not out of pity, but because she recognized that moment, when the mind, bloated with words and bravado, finally surrendered to the body's truth, that everyone wants to be seen. Underneath all the roles, the names, the debts and titles, that was the only certainty Livia ever found in the world. The desire to be known and not judged. It united them all, rich and poor, cruel and kind, philosopher and drunkard. It was why they came to her, not for pleasure, not always, and not even for escape, but to be witnessed, to say, "I am here, I exist," and for someone to answer wordlessly, yes. Livia never thought of herself as a wise woman. She left wisdom to the marble-browed statues and the men who quoted them. But she knew how to listen to stories, and she knew how to carry them gently. Sometimes she retold them to herself in the darkness, not aloud, but in memory, stitching them together like a quilt made from other people's lives. There was the mother who came to her weeping, not because she had lost her child, but because she had not cried at the funeral. There was the boy who told her, between hiccuping sobs and trembling fingers, that he had never touched another person without shame. There was the nobleman who asked her if she believed in reincarnation, and when she asked why, he said, "Because this life cannot be my only chance to get it right." She remembered all of them, not as clients, not even as moments, but as mirrors of herself. For in each of them, she saw something she had also carried: grief, hope, uncertainty, fear, longing. She had offered them presents. But they, in turn, had given her something just as valuable: the confirmation that she was not alone in her searching. Livia turned onto her side in the dim lamplight, her hand resting lightly on the edge of the bed, fingers curled just slightly. The room was quiet, the city beyond even quieter. She could almost hear the rhythm of her own heartbeat matching the subtle breath of Rome at rest. Though she was not yet asleep, her body was fully still, her mind adrift but untroubled. These late hours were not about solutions. They were not for planning, nor for grieving. They were the soft place where stories came to settle, where memories were allowed to arrive without fear of being judged or re-examined. She thought of the many things she had heard over the years, confessions and dreams, superstitions and longings, all delivered in low voices under painted ceilings or whispered into her ear like secrets meant only for the dark. These things had shaped her not as burdens, but as layers. She had become, in a way, a keeper of fragments, a collector of broken truths, uncertain hopes, and private philosophies too fragile for the day. And what had she done with all these pieces? Not much by the measure of the world. She had not written scrolls or spoken in assemblies. No temple bore her name, and no poet had sung her praises in the forum. But within her, a quiet record had been kept, a kind of unwritten library, full of lives she had touched, and who had touched her in return. The city outside knew only the outlines of her life. A woman in a certain place, of a certain kind, seen sometimes on this street or that one, with this man or that name. But within her, whole constellations of human feeling moved. Joy offered through trembling lips, apologies made without words, forgiveness asked in the way a hand might tremble before reaching out. These things did not make her famous, but they made her real. And in a city that prized marble and myth, sometimes to be real was the rarest thing of all. Perhaps she thought that was her philosophy, that presence itself was holy, that to live without turning away from what is hard or tender or uncertain, that was enough. The oil in her lamp burned low now, the flame small but steady. She looked at it a long while, not for light but for company. Flame, she had once heard, was a conversation between wood and air. But oil flame was different, quieter, more patient. Like her, it did not roar. It breathed. She let her own breathing fall in rhythm with it. And as she finally allowed her eyes to close, her thoughts softened into something wordless. Not silence exactly, but something deeper. The silence that comes not from absence, but from understanding. The kind that lives inside stories after they've been told. The kind that settles around the truth like a blanket. She did not know what tomorrow would bring. She never had. But she trusted that she would meet it with the same eyes, the same stillness, the same quiet readiness to listen and to carry what others could not say aloud. And for now, that was enough. The lamp gave a final flicker. The room turned warm with shadow. And Livia, wrapped in the comfort of stories remembered and moments fully lived, drifted quietly into sleep. Chapter 9. A quiet kind of power, survival, and subtle influence. Power in Rome was not always declared. It did not always arrive in togas edged with purple, or chariots drawn by white horses. It did not always carry scrolls sealed with wax or echo in the marble halls of the Senate. More often than not, true power moved quietly, like water beneath stone, like breath in the dark. It flowed not through proclamations, but through presence. Livia had long understood this, not because anyone taught her, but because the city itself whispered the lesson over time. She had watched the proud fall and the voiceless rise, had seen coins change hands only to return to the same palms days later, had heard names shouted from balconies that were forgotten by sunset. Power was not always what others saw. It was what you carried, what you chose to reveal, and what you kept entirely your own. Her life was not defined by wealth or protection. She had no patrons to secure her place, no family name to shield her, and yet she endured. She navigated a world built to forget women like her, and in doing so, she learned how to be remembered without ever needing to be known. Her influence was not overt. It was not shouted or sold. It was built carefully and slowly, in places no one thought to look. In a whispered recommendation passed from wife to friend, in a name spoken softly by a senator to a visiting merchant, in a glance exchanged across a crowded atrium, where a man lowered his voice because he suddenly felt himself observed. Livia understood that the heart of power was attention, and more than that, discretion. It wasn't simply what you knew, but how you carried what you knew. She had heard secrets that could have brought ruin, held confessions in her hands like cracked pottery, but she never broke what was given to her. She had learned that trust, once earned and kept, was stronger than any chain. It bought her safety where coin could not. It bought her passage into rooms where other women were never seen. She did not barter with information. She honored it, and in return people returned. Men of power, yes, but also their wives, their servants, their sons. Not always for pleasure, but for the relief of being seen without having to perform. There was, in this, a kind of power that even the city could not strip from her. A quiet power, the kind that lived not in ownership, but in presence. That she could walk into a room and change its mood without raising her voice. That she could hear someone speak and know what they had not said. That she could refuse and her refusal would be respected, not because she threatened, but because she never had to. This was the power that Rome, in its arrogance, often overlooked. But it was the power that survived. Livia did not see herself as exceptional. She saw herself as observant, careful, enduring, and that was enough. In a city that devoured the careless and silenced the loud, she had chosen another way. She did not shout. She listened. She did not demand. She understood. And she knew that this, too, was influence, the kind that outlasted fire, coin, and name, not written in stone, but held in the living memory of those who knew her, who spoke of her only in low voices and always with respect. The strength Livia carried was not the kind one could show with gestures or titles. It was woven into the way she moved through space. Never hurried, never hesitant. Her steps neither loud nor timid, but anchored. Even in the company of those who outranked her by blood or coin, she never diminished herself. Not because she believed she was their equal in standing, but because she did not believe the measure of a person was found in what they wore or where they sat. Her confidence was not defiance. It was earned. It had been carved slowly into her over years of watching, listening, and surviving. In a world where a woman's silence was often demanded and her voice easily dismissed, Livia had chosen to speak with her presence. And presence, when honed with patience and awareness, could bend the behavior of a room more powerfully than any decree. She could feel it happen. The way men sat straighter when she entered. The way women lowered their voices, then raised them again, stronger, as if her calm granted them permission. This influence, this quiet command, did not grow in isolation. It was rooted in her relationships, not just with clients, but with other women, with workers, with those whom society preferred to ignore. Livia was not alone, though the city often tried to make women like her believe they were. She knew washerwomen who kept track of which families were secretly moving across districts. She knew midwives who heard more confessions than any priest. She knew cooks and scribes and servants who moved unseen through the homes of Rome, carrying knowledge like coals beneath a basket. And these women spoke to her, not always in words, sometimes in glances, in the placement of a dish, in the way a door was opened or closed. She paid attention to all of it. She never assumed anything unimportant. Power, she had learned, lived in detail, in the choice of a hairpin, in the fold of a letter, in who entered a room and in what order they left. She saw what others missed because she was never trying to control the room, only to understand it. Among the women she called friend, though few would have used the word aloud, there was no need for ceremony. They shared scraps of bread, bits of news, the names of men to avoid. They shared laughter and silence in equal measure. They shared space, and in that space Livia never had to perform. These were the women who stitched her garments, who knew when her voice trembled, who saw her when her eyes were tired from too much pretending. With them, she did not need to speak wisely. She only needed to be true, and from those moments, she drew her deepest strength. Not from admiration, but from recognition. She was not the only one who had chosen to survive with dignity in a world that offered little. She was not the only one who had made herself into something no one had planned for. These women, nameless in the ledgers of history, were not powerless. They were the ones who knew how to endure, how to help one another without asking, how to protect not only their bodies, but their hearts and one another's names. In them, Livia saw herself, not alone, not forgotten, but part of something older and wiser than Rome itself. There were moments, sometimes, when Livia would walk the city and sense her place in it not just as a figure passing through, but as part of its very structure. Unseen, perhaps, but essential. Rome was built on many kinds of stone, marble, travertine, brick, but also memory, silence, and the choices of those no one ever wrote about. And Livia, like the women who came before and would come after her, was one of those foundation stones. She thought of this sometimes as she passed under archways or stood in the shadow of temples, watching as senators and soldiers passed by unaware of the way women like her shaped the city in invisible ways. She did not need a statue, nor a name carved into stone. The power she held was not for the eyes. It was in what she could create with a glance, what she could undo with a single refusal, what she carried in her gaze when someone underestimated her. It was in the way she knew how to say just enough, and how to leave silence in her wake like a question that no one quite knew how to answer. She remembered one particular afternoon, not long ago, when a wealthy merchant had attempted to shame her in the presence of others. His words were casual, meant to draw laughter, but they had fallen into silence instead, because Livia had not reacted. She had simply looked at him, not with anger, but with a gaze so calm, so unimpressed, that his confidence unraveled like thread. He had expected a retort or a blush, and when neither came, he had turned his eyes away. Power was not always loud. Sometimes it was the refusal to perform. Sometimes it was the decision to hold your ground, to say nothing, and to let the weight of another's words collapse under their own hollowness. That was the kind of strength Livia had honed. Not the power to dominate, but the power to endure, to observe, to choose. And more than that, the power to create space for others to feel seen, safe, and unjudged. It was a gift not many recognized, but one that could change the entire shape of a conversation, a room, a life. As the evening deepened and the light in her room began to dim, Livia stood by her window once again, watching Rome fall into its softer version of itself. A mother was lighting a small oil lamp, guiding her daughter's hands. A boy was singing to himself as he swept dust into a corner. A woman down the street was hanging herbs to dry, her hands quick and rhythmic. None of them knew Livia, not truly, and yet she felt connected to them all. The city was not made by the men whose names history kept. It was made, over and over, by the women who carried water and stories, who remembered what others forgot, who endured without being asked if they wished to. That was her kind of power, shared in glances, in gestures, in trust earned slowly and held quietly. She didn't need it to be seen. She only needed it to be real. And it was, as real as the stone beneath her feet, as the breath in her chest. A quiet kind of power, yes, but a power that had kept her not only alive, but whole. Chapter 10. Nightfall and dreams. The day fades away. Night in Rome was never completely silent. Even as the city slept, it breathed, through creaking beams, distant footsteps. The flutter of pigeons startled into flight. Somewhere in the labyrinth of streets, a dog barked twice and fell silent. A cart rolled across cobblestone, its wheels echoing down an empty alley like a memory. But in Livia's small room above the street, there was stillness, not just of sound, but of spirit. The lamp on her shelf flickered low, casting soft shadows that danced slowly along the plastered wall. The objects of her day, her shawl, her comb, the worn sandals near the door, rested in their familiar places, as though they too had exhaled. She lay upon her cot with the blanket pulled to her shoulders, her face turned toward the open shutter, where the sky shone silver and black, sprinkled with stars that felt impossibly ancient and near all at once. Her body, softened by the rhythms of the day, no longer carried the posture of attention. It simply existed, warm, breathing, complete. There was something sacred about these last moments before sleep, not because they were dramatic, but because they were hers alone. She had given much that day: presence, listening, gentleness, attention. She had offered her hands, her eyes, her stillness. Now, in the quiet curve of night, she returned to herself. Her thoughts drifted like slow-moving clouds, not heavy, not sharp. She thought of a line she had heard once from a traveling poet, that dreams were where the gods came closest, not because they chose to, but because the veil was thinnest. Livia did not know if she believed in gods in the way temples taught, but she believed in dreams. Not only the ones that visited her in sleep, but the ones that had stayed with her even when life tried to scrape them away. Small ones, mostly, to wake without fear, to be remembered not for scandal, but for kindness, to hold her own name as a thing of value. These were not dreams of marble or triumph. They were dreams of water, of sunlight on a quiet path, of a voice speaking her name with care, and they had kept her company for years. The city outside faded into low murmurs and then to hush. Even the taverns had quieted now, and the sounds that remained were soft and real wind, the wooden groan of shutters adjusting to cool night air, the faraway cry of an owl. Livia closed her eyes and saw not darkness, but warmth. She imagined the Tiber, slow and silver beneath the moon, its waters carrying fragments of everything: hopes, ashes, petals from offerings at forgotten altars. She imagined walking beside it barefoot, the soil cool beneath her feet, each step light and free. In the dream, no one watched her. No one needed her to be anything. She was simply there, alive, whole, peace. That was the dream she returned to each night. Not of escape, but of wholeness. Of being allowed to belong not as a role, not as a need, but simply as herself. As she drifted deeper, her breath slowed, the room grew dimmer, and the lamp finally flickered out, leaving behind only warmth, memory, and the hush of a woman who had lived this day with quiet grace. In the deepening quiet of the night, Livia's breath moved in soft, even waves. Though her eyes were closed, her mind still hovered gently between the fading world of the day and the first shadows of dreaming. In this space, time loosened its grip. She no longer felt the hours pressing forward, no longer sensed the city's demands. Instead, what remained was sensation, the warmth of linen against her shoulder, the faint impression of the mattress beneath her spine, the distant scent of cooling clay from the bowl beside her bed. Her mind wandered in images now, not thoughts. A fig sliced open under morning sun, the ripple of wind across a curtain, the smile of a stranger who had never returned, but whose eyes had stayed in her memory like an open door. These fragments drifted gently through her, not seeking order or explanation. They were like petals on water, each one complete in its own drifting, beautiful only because they did not stay. She thought, without trying to, of the women she had passed on the street that morning. Some young, others bent with years. All of them walking through a city that asked them to endure in silence. Each woman a story, a rhythm, a quiet strength the city would likely never name. Livia had learned to see them, not just their clothes or posture, but the energy in their gaze, the slight tightness around the mouth, the way they carried their baskets or held their children's hands. She had learned that survival took many shapes. Some wore it with defiance, others with grace, others with weariness. And though they were rarely spoken of as powerful, Livia knew better. She had drawn her own strength from them, from the midwife who worked with her sleeves rolled up, bare arms strong and soft with soot, from the elderly woman who sold herbs with a voice as crisp as winter, from the girl who once gave Livia a peach without asking for coin, saying only, "You looked like you needed it." These moments had become the foundations of Livia's belief, not in empire or temple, but in quiet generosity, in unnoticed courage. The thoughts began to fade now, slowly, gently, like mist retreating before dawn. Livia's body had gone soft with stillness, her limbs heavy with rest, her breath now deep and unconscious. But within her, a subtle knowing remained, that today had passed without breaking her, that she had given what she chose to give and held what she chose to keep, that she had moved through the world with eyes open, listening, witnessing, shaping her place not with force but with presence. This brought her peace. It was not the peace of a life without hardship, nor the peace of certainty. It was the peace of alignment, the rare and precious feeling of having lived the day as truly as she could. The peace of knowing that even if no one remembered her name in 100 years, she had existed in full, had mattered in the small human way that few dared to value. And with that final exhale, as her breath fell into the rhythm of dreaming, the day dissolved like a tide pulling softly away from the shore. Her room, quiet now, held only the hush of night, the whisper of dreams, and the presence of a life fully lived. And so, the day came to its quiet end, not with a final word, not with a grand gesture, but with a breath, a pause, a slow retreat into stillness. Outside Livia's window, the stars shifted in their ancient patterns, unconcerned with the quiet dramas of the city below. The moon traced its gentle arc, spilling soft light across tiled roofs and narrow courtyards where dreams now gathered like smoke. Rome slept, the powerful and the poor, the restless and the weary, all lay beneath the same sky, their stories silenced for a few precious hours. In her small room, Livia drifted deeper into sleep, her breath as steady as a tide. Around her, the city's night sounds softened further, the rustle of wind through fig leaves, the click of a shutter settling into place, the distant echo of a guard's sandals fading along the street. Nothing called to her now. No names, no demands, no roles to resume. The world had let go, and she had let it go in return. In her dreams, the streets of Rome were empty and golden, bathed in that strange light that exists only in memory. She walked them not as someone on duty, not as someone watched or sought after, but as herself, unseen, unburdened. The city welcomed her in this form, whispering her name not in the mouths of clients, but in the stones themselves, in the fountains, in the scent of pressed olives and warm bread. She moved past familiar places, the market, the bathhouse, the temple steps, but they were quiet now, and in their silence, they seemed to acknowledge her in a way the day never had. She walked with bare feet and open hands. In this dream, nothing was missing, not the future she had never lived, nor the past she had survived. Everything was whole, even the pain she had carried, even the sorrow she had tucked away in the folds of her smile. Here, in this quiet dream Rome, it all had its place. And because it had a place, it no longer hurt. Simply was, like the water, like the wind, like sleep. And somewhere between that dream and the morning not yet born, Livia became still. Not as one who disappears, but as one who rests fully. Her name did not echo in history, but it echoed in breath, in the thoughts of those who had shared a moment with her, in the kindness she had offered without being asked. Her power had never been loud. Her life had never been written, but it had been lived, fully and quietly, in the hidden chambers of the greatest city in the world. And that was enough. The flame in her room had long since gone out. The curtain fluttered gently in the night breeze. Her body lay wrapped in soft linen, her hands calm, her face at peace. Outside, Rome continued to turn in its sleep. But here, in this room, a single soul rested completely, the stories of the day folded away like fabric at the foot of the bed, waiting for morning or for nothing at all. Just the hush of night, just the dream, just the quiet presence of a woman who, without ever raising her voice, had learned how to shape the world with silence. And so the day fades, gently, like a candle burning low. If this story brought you a moment of rest or reflection, we invite you to support the channel with a like. And if you haven't yet, a quiet subscription means the world. More stories await. Until next time, may your night be calm, your dreams be kind, and your soul remain softly anchored in peace. Good night.